The survivors in the game is that even if they know where something is, they don't remember how to get back to it, or where it was, or what it's near, or they don't recognize the very specific types of tiles and what's always related to being above or below them. So let's talk about that. The meatpacking plant, or the game, consists of a 4x4 tile area on 2 different floors. So that's 16 tiles on the top and 16 tiles on the bottom. Most of these tiles, if not all of them, are attached vertically, which means whatever's on the top, if you know what is usually below that, that's what is below that. There are some exceptions to this, like where the stair tiles are. There's so many stair tiles that technically there's no way to know exactly what's below it, but the corner tiles especially, and certain drop down tiles that can spawn in the middle, basically they always have the same thing underneath them. So as soon as you know that much, you know different tiles. And so now let's talk about the different tiles that you're gonna get, the top and the bottom. The first room we'll talk about is the control room. And the control room always has the bathroom and the basement below it. This tile is super strong both on the top and the bottom, because on the top you have 2 super safe pallets, and on the bottom you have 2 god pallets. Of course, on the bottom you also have the basement, and of course the bathroom is a dead end tile that you don't really want to be caught in, because basically the killer's going to get a free hit unless you have head on or something like that to use the lockers inside. But let's focus on the top floor. It has a vault, and it has 7 lockers, and including one of probably the least used lockers in all of Dead by Daylight, the locker that's actually in the little control booth. The last thing I'll say about this tile is, number 1, the upstairs pallets are pretty safe, and I would never say to waste pallets, but I would definitely make sure that you don't run into this room and just literally waste these pallets right away, because this is such a strong corner, especially if the downstairs pallets are still up during like late game things. With that being said, the downstairs pallets are also considered god pallets, and they're right by the basement. So these can be considered like shack pallet with the basement in shack. Like, this is a very important pallet. I would say if you're downstairs near these pallets and you have other options, do not waste these god pallets. In fact, I would even say if it's not like late game and you're full health and you actually don't have any other options, I would probably just take a hit and run past these god pallets, because if somebody gets put in the basement, those god pallets can be super, super helpful, and it's just not worth wasting them right away. But yeah, that's gonna do it for this tile. So now we'll talk about the stair tiles that spawn on the edge of the map. And this is gonna be a little bit of a longer explanation because there's a bit of a mind game depending on where the pallet is. First thing that I'll say is sometimes there's not a pallet on this tile at all. But usually if there's not one upstairs, you can be pretty sure there is one downstairs. And if there's not one downstairs, there's probably one upstairs. Again though, it's not always like this. Sometimes you do get super unlucky and you get one of these stair side tiles that doesn't have a pallet at all. It's pretty safe to assume that if you don't see one up top, there's probably one downstairs. And if there's not one downstairs, there's probably one upstairs. There's never both at the same time, and there is sometimes nothing in either spot at all. With that being said, let's talk about how to loop these tiles when there is a pallet there. If there's a pallet downstairs, in my experience, that pallet usually doesn't get looped. Usually you just eat up distance with something nearby, and then when you just get to the pallet when you know the killer's getting close enough to hit you. You could though technically loop around the square that is the stairs to where the pallet is, I guess. But with so much wall breaking your line of sight, the killer could easily moonwalk mind game with their red light or do something else to confuse you and potentially hit you, wasting the whole looping this area strategy. So typically people eat up distance with like a couple of boxes that are sitting nearby, or just running in a weird way, making the killer think you're going up the stairs. Whatever you need to do to waste a little bit of distance, and then just try to make sure you get the pallets done to utilize the pallet as much as possible. That's for the downstairs pallet. The upstairs pallet, when it spawns upstairs and not downstairs, can be compared to the Badham Preschool 2-story that we talked about in the previous video, which is going to be linked in the description below, where the killer has the opportunity to take a shortcut by jumping off the ledge and onto the stairs to cut you off when you're looping around, because it's typical to loop around this stairway spot. A good strategy to use is to loop this area clockwise because of where the pallet spawns. If you loop it counterclockwise, the killer's going to cut you off from the pallet and force you to eat up distance, which if you have enough distance, or if you respawn quick enough, you can run back around to the pallet, you're fine. But if you just loop it clockwise every single time, the only time the killer can cut you off is when you're literally in the pallet. And if they do cut you off and you didn't drop the pallet, you're totally fine. You're gonna get a free stun basically, or just at least a free pallet drop, in which case the killer either one has to kick the pallet or go all the way around the pallet to catch back up. Up to you. It's not a good idea to panic vault any pallet, which is when you vault back and forth really quickly to avoid getting hit by the killer from either side. But specifically with this pallet, you don't want to start panic vaulting it. If you drop it and the killer is on the stairway side, you should always immediately run. Don't play around this pallet, even if they don't kick it, in my opinion, because they can always take that shortcut and cut you off. With that being said, I think I dragged this tile out a little long, so if you have any other questions about the shortcut the killer can make, I recommend giving it a try with your friends, or, playing killer yourself on this map and just trying to cut off survivors as best you can. Anyway, next.
New Chobani Probiotics.
Next tile. The next tile we're going to talk about is this sort of like drop down tile where you go up the stairs and there's a vault to go downstairs. The first thing I want to say about this room for all the like Blendet players out there is that there's like 7 spots in this room to hide. Actually, there's probably like 4 or 5 spots. Little tiny corners that I would personally never go in, but some people's playstyle is to kind of hide. And so I should mention that this room is full of corners where totems can also spawn in some of them. The general rule of thumb for this room is to run right up the stairs and vault immediately. The killer has 2 options. options. Either they're going to vault directly behind you, and if they're close enough, you're going to have to use the pallet downstairs. But if they're far enough away and you vault right away, that might not be a super good idea, because there's usually a nearby tile that has a drop down near where you're going. So if you have like a fucking crazy amount of distance, I wouldn't recommend jumping right away. But there's like a sweet spot between them being close enough to almost hit you and far enough away to flank around and go downstairs another way and cut you off. Other than that, the downstairs literally just has a pallet, sometimes a hook, and occasionally a totem hidden like behind in the corner or something. Not much to be said about this tile, just a basic filler loop. You would run in a circle around it, whatever. Pretty self-explanatory, and yeah. This next tile won't take long. It's just one of the door tiles where the shelves spawn. Sometimes there's a pallet in between these shelves, but not always, just like everything. In this case, there's no like downstairs equivalent, because the downstairs, there's no way to like directly access the downstairs for this tile.
Thank you for the delicious pain. I saw the truth at the end. I die knowing I did the right thing by betraying you and returning to the service of the Dark Lord.